Chicago, 1983. A biting winter wind scraped down Michigan Avenue, rattling street signs, stinging exposed skin, and turning every breath into a thin cloud of frost. Inside the Chicago theater, warmth radiated through thousands of eager fans, waiting for Stevie Wonder to take the stage. Backstage, musicians tuned their instruments, while stagehands rushed between cables and spotlights. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that only follows an artist whose music could soften the hardest hearts and lift the heaviest spirits. Yet as Stevie stood near the stage entrance, head tilted slightly, he wasn't listening to the crowd cheering his name. He was listening to something else, something faint, distant, carried by the wind through a cracked backstage door. He felt it before he heard it, a quiet hum wrapped in cold air, a trembling voice singing to no one. Just outside the theater's loading alley sat Raymond Holt, a blind, homeless man bundled in layers of fume, mismatched coats, an old wool hat pulled low over his brow. He cupped his hands around his mouth, blowing warm air onto his fingers before rubbing them together to chase the numbness from his knuckles. Beside him sat a metal cup with only 2 coins inside, their soft clinks drowned out by buses roaring past and the muffled excitement coming from the theater wall he leaned against. Raymond wasn't begging loudly. He never did. Instead, he sang to himself in a soft rasp, old gospel hymns. His grandmother taught him long before life had taken everything but his voice and his stubborn will to survive. His notes were cracked and weary, but honest, woven with pain, memory, and a kind of broken beauty that came only from living through storms most people never faced. Stevie's chest tightened. There was something in that voice, something familiar, like an echo from a past he couldn't fully place. Without hesitation, Stevie turned to the nearest security guard and said, "There's a man outside. Give him $100 for me." The guard blinked, startled. Musicians paused mid-tune. Assistants exchanged confused glances. Stevie didn't explain, didn't elaborate, didn't bother pretending it was part of some show. His voice carried quiet urgency. "He needs it," Stevie whispered. What Stevie didn't know, what no one inside that warm, glowing theater could have guessed, was that the blind, homeless man shivering in the alley wasn't just any stranger in the cold. He was someone whose identity, once revealed, would stop Stevie Wonder in his tracks and rewrite the entire night. The guard hesitated for a moment, unsure whether Stevie's request was a casual act of charity or something more pressing. But the seriousness in Stevie's face, the way he kept tilting his head as if listening beyond the walls, pushed him into motion. He stepped out into the freezing alleyway, his breath turning white instantly, and spotted Raymond hunched beside the dumpster. "Hey, brother," the guard called softly, approaching with caution. Raymond didn't flinch. He only lifted his chin slightly, his clouded eyes searching for the direction of the voice. "Yes, sir," he answered, voice small and worn. The guard pressed the folded bill into Raymond's gloved hand. "From Stevie Wonder," he explained. Raymond's brow tightened. "Stevie Wonder," he repeated slowly, as if the name awakened a memory buried under years of hardship. His thumb brushed over the paper, recognizing the crispness that meant far more than pocket change. His lips trembled. "Tell him, thank you," he whispered, though he doubted anyone inside would ever hear it. But Stevie did hear something subtle, a sound carried faintly on the wind. Raymond had begun humming again, this time a little louder, warmed by the unexpected kindness. Stevie's eyebrows lifted. The melody, he knew that melody. It was a gospel tune from decades earlier, a song his own mother used to play on Sunday mornings, a song not many people outside Detroit churches ever learned. Stevie walked closer to the stage door, ignoring the startled looks from his team. "Open it," he said quietly. The guard rushed to comply, swinging the heavy metal door until the winter air spilled into the backstage corridor. The moment it opened, the voice came through clearer, weathered, aching, stuffed with pain, but carrying a tone that hit Stevie like a hand over the heart. He lowered his head, stunned. "I know that voice," he whispered. Musicians behind him exchanged glances. Stevie didn't speak like that unless something powerful had gripped him. "Go get him," Stevie said suddenly. "Now." The guard hurried back down the alley, this time with a new urgency. Raymond stiffened when he heard the footsteps returning, instinctively pulling his cup closer to his chest. "Sir," the guard said gently, "Stevie wants to meet you." Raymond froze. A tremor ran through his entire body, not from cold, but from shock. "Meet me," he repeated, disbelief scratching through every word. He wasn't used to being wanted. He wasn't used to being seen. The guard placed a steady hand under his elbow. "Come on," he said softly. Raymond rose slowly, leaning heavily on the wall to balance himself. Every step toward the open door felt unreal, like he was being pulled into a world he no longer belonged to. And as the warm backstage air hit his face, melting the leftover frost on his cheeks, Raymond Holt had no idea that Stevie Wonder was standing just a few feet away, remembering a voice he once admired long before either of their lives had taken such different paths. Raymond stepped into the backstage corridor slowly, his worn boots leaving faint tracks of melted snow on the concrete floor. The warmth wrapped around him instantly, loosening the stiff ache in his joints, but his breath still trembled in his chest. He held his metal cup tightly, as if afraid someone might take it away. The noise backstage quieted as crew members noticed him, a blind, shivering man, layered in mismatched coats, standing uncertainly beneath the glow of the overhead lights. Some stared with confusion, others with sympathy, but all fell silent when Stevie Wonder stepped forward. Stevie didn't rush, didn't speak immediately. He simply listened, head tilted, face softening, as Raymond's faint humming drifted off into silence. There it was again, that familiar tone, that shape in the voice that tugged at a memory Stevie had carried since childhood. Stevie took one careful step closer. "Brother," he said gently, "what's your name?" Raymond swallowed hard, his hands trembling around the cup. "Raymond, sir. Raymond Holt." The moment the name left his lips, Stevie felt something inside him shift, like a door unlocking in his mind. Stevie inhaled sharply, a quiet gasp slipping from him before he could hide it. "Holt," he repeated, his voice barely above. A whisper. Behind him, musicians exchanged curious glances. Stevie stepped closer, his hand hovering near Raymond's sleeve. "Raymond Holt from Detroit?" Raymond's jaw clenched as he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Born there. Left a long time ago." Stevie's breath shook. He remembered it now. The youth choir competitions, the neighborhood talent shows, the afternoons when his mother used to drag him to church gatherings in Detroit's West Side. There had been a boy, older than Stevie by a few years, with a voice so powerful people used to fall silent mid-sentence to hear him sing. A boy named Raymond Holt. A boy who disappeared. Stevie swallowed hard, emotion tightening his voice. "You," Stevie whispered, "you used to sing at New Mount Zion Church." Raymond's knees nearly buckled. His gloved hand flew to his mouth as a broken sound escaped him. "Lord," he whispered, shaking, "ain't nobody said that name to me in years." The truth crashed into Stevie with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't just a homeless man outside a theater. This was the Raymond Holt, the young prodigy whose voice once shook entire church basements, the kid Stevie had admired from afar before fame swept him into a different world. Stevie reached out, placing a gentle hand on Raymond's shoulder. "Brother," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I used to listen to you. I used to stand in the back of those church halls hoping you'd sing just one more verse." Tears welled behind Stevie's glasses. Raymond trembled where he stood, his blindness making it impossible to see the awe on Stevie's face, but he felt the sincerity in his touch. "I ain't nobody now," Raymond whispered, shame creeping into his voice like a shadow. Stevie shook his head slowly, gripping his shoulder with both hands. "You're wrong," he said softly. "You're the same voice that made a whole neighborhood believe in something." And as Raymond stood there shaking, surrounded by warmth he hadn't known in years, he finally realized, Stevie Wonder hadn't given him $100 out of pity. He had given it to him out of recognition and respect. Raymond's breath shook in his chest as he tried to make sense of Stevie's words. The noise backstage faded into nothing. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat and the soft hum of the furnace blowing warm air across the room. "You remember me?" Raymond whispered, his voice trembling like he was afraid the question itself might break. Stevie nodded slowly, both hands still resting firmly on Raymond's shoulders. "I remember the way you sang Precious Lord in that tiny church basement," Stevie said, emotion thick in every syllable. "I remember people crying before you even reached the chorus. I remember thinking, If I could sing like him one day, maybe I'll have a chance. Raymond covered his face with both hands, overwhelmed. He had spent so many years believing he had faded from the world, become invisible. To learn that Stevie Wonder, of all people, had once stood in the shadows listening to him felt impossible, like a dream so cruelly beautiful it hurt. Raymond lowered his hands slowly, tears streaking down the grime on his cheeks. Life, it ain't been kind, Stevie. His voice cracked on the last word. It was the first time he'd said Stevie's name with any familiarity, the first time he allowed himself to believe he wasn't speaking to a superstar, but to a boy who had once admired him. I lost my job, lost my family, lost my eyesight, lost everything I knew. His voice softened to a whisper, and I thought God forgot about me. Stevie shook his head with a firmness that made Raymond flinch. No, brother, God didn't forget. You've just been walking through a storm. He paused, then added quietly, and storms end. Raymond's lips trembled as he let out a breath he'd been holding for years. No one had spoken hope into him in so long, he almost didn't recognize what it felt like. Stevie squeezed his shoulder gently. Come sit, he said, guiding Raymond toward a small wooden chair near the wall. Let me hear your voice again. Crew members stepped aside instantly, giving the two men space. Raymond's hands shook violently as Stevie helped him sit. I don't sound like I used to, Raymond warned, shame dragging down each word. Stevie crouched in front of him, face soft and calm. Voices change, he said. Souls deepen, pain sharpens. The truth inside a note. He reached for a second microphone and placed it gently in Raymond's hands. The metal was cold against Raymond's palms, but it felt like a lifeline, something alive, something full of possibility. Just hum, Stevie said softly. That same hymn you sang outside. Raymond hesitated, throat tight. But then he lifted his chin and released a trembling hum into the microphone, thin at first, but unmistakably him. Stevie's eyes filled with tears. The backstage fell, silent again. And in that fragile moment, it became clear to everyone watching, Raymond Holt had not lost his gift. He had only lost the world that once heard it. Now he was being given back a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. Raymond's hum wavered in the microphone like a fragile thread pulled from the fabric of his past, thin, trembling, but carrying a truth no hardship had managed to erase. Stevie leaned in, eyes closed behind his glasses, letting the sound wash through him. The timbre was older now, weathered by cold nights and hungry days, but the soul inside it, that was untouched, still warm, still honest, still unmistakably Raymond Holt. As Raymond continued, the hum grew steadier, gaining strength as if each second of being heard breathed life back into him. Stagehands stopped moving. Musicians set their instruments down gently. No one wanted to interrupt. Even the furnace seemed quieter, as though the entire building recognized the sacredness of the moment. Stevie nodded slowly, emotion rising in his throat. That's it, he whispered. That's the voice I remember. Raymond's lips quivered. He hadn't heard that kind of affirmation in decades. His entire body shook as memories he had locked away pushed to the surface. Church halls filled with clapping hands, pastors wiping tears, his grandmother calling him her little angel with a golden throat. He never thought he would feel that version of himself again. Stevie stood and reached blindly for the keyboard behind him, his fingers finding the first chord with practiced instinct. A soft, warm tone filled the backstage corridor, rising into the air like steam. Raymond stiffened. That chord. He knew that chord. Not just the song, but the exact way Stevie played it. It was the hymn they used to sing in Detroit, the one that made elders rock in their seats and children sway unconsciously. Stevie began the progression, slow and gentle, leaving an open space in the melody for a voice that had once led a room full of believers. Raymond swallowed hard, his throat tightening with fear and longing tangled together. I can't, he whispered. I ain't sung with music in so long. My voice, it's broken. Stevie shook his head. No, brother, it's alive. The words hit Raymond like a jolt. He tightened his grip on the microphone, breathing in shakily. The music wrapped around him like a blanket, inviting him in. And slowly, hesitantly, he let his voice rise again. This time, the sound that came out wasn't a hum. It was a note, a real note, shaped and lifted by the remnants of a once powerful gift. The note cracked, splitting in the middle, but the raw emotion inside it made every person in the room gasp. It was heartbreak and hope woven into one trembling sound. It was every hardship Raymond had endured laid bare. Stevie felt the weight of it hit him straight in the chest. "There you are," Stevie breathed, tears pushing past his composure. Raymond pushed through another note, then another, each one steadier than the last. His voice was battered, yes, but not broken. The pain in it gave the song a depth no young voice could ever reach, and the humility behind it made the moment feel almost holy. People backstage covered their mouths. One lighting tech wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. A backup singer whispered, "Dear God," as if witnessing a resurrection. And in a way she was, because as Raymond's voice filled that warm, cluttered backstage hallway, the man who had been forgotten by nearly everyone, including himself, began to come back to life. Raymond's voice, cracked, trembling, scarred by years of struggle, floated through the backstage like incense drifting through an old church. Each note carried the weight of everything he had lost: his sight, his stability, his family, his belief that he still mattered in a world that had forgotten him. But underneath that exhaustion lived something indestructible, something holy, something that hadn't been extinguished, not by poverty, not by cold nights, not by loneliness. Stevie played softer now, letting Raymond's voice take the lead, giving him space to remember who he once was. The chord progression wrapped around him like gentle arms, lifting him up from years of collapse. Raymond's shoulders straightened, his breath deepened. The second verse came easier. He didn't sound polished, not anymore, but he sounded true. And truth has a way of silencing every room it touches. As Raymond sang, something in the room changed. Crew members were no longer watching a moment. They were witnessing a transformation. A makeup artist covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks as Raymond's voice cracked midline, not from weakness, but from the sheer emotional force behind it. A sound engineer leaned back against a wall, exhaling shakily as goosebumps rose along his arms. The backup singers had gone still, their eyes locked on Raymond with awe, recognizing the kind of soul-born resonance that can't be taught. Even the musicians, men who had toured the world with Stevie, stood frozen in reverence. This was not fame. This was not spectacle. This was the resurrection of a voice that life had buried deep beneath suffering. And the deeper he sang, the more the man who had arrived shivering and invisible in the alley dissolved into the Raymond Holt of decades ago. The Raymond whose voice had once held entire congregations in its palm. Stevie's fingers slowed, letting the final chord linger in the air like a long exhale. Raymond's last note wavered, trembling with emotion, before settling into silence. He lowered the microphone slowly, his hands shaking uncontrollably. For a moment he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't breathe. He looked like a man standing in the aftermath of a storm he didn't realize he had survived. I ain't sung like that in years," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Stevie stepped toward him, tears slipping freely down his cheeks now. He didn't hide them, didn't wipe them away. He simply placed a hand over Raymond's heart. "Brother," he said softly, voice breaking, "that wasn't singing, that was life. That was everything you've been carrying, and it was beautiful." Raymond's face crumpled, a sob escaping him as he bowed his head. Stevie pulled him into a gentle embrace, warm, real, steady. And as Raymond clung to him, crying into Stevie's shoulder, everyone in the room understood. Moments like this don't happen on stages. They happen in the quiet corners where broken people are reminded they still matter, still shine, still have something inside them the world needs. Raymond clung to Stevie with a trembling desperation, the kind that only comes from a man who has spent years carrying his pain alone. His cries were soft at first, choked, muffled against Stevie's shoulder, but soon the weight of everything he had endured poured out of him in shaking sobs. The room stayed completely still. No one moved, no one whispered, no one dared to break the sacredness of what was happening. For decades, Raymond Holt had been invisible, another homeless man on a freezing street, another soul lost to the shadows of a city that didn't have time to care. But here, in this warm backstage hallway under flickering lights, he was being held by the very person whose music had once given him hope, the boy who used to look up to him, the superstar who recognized his voice before knowing his name. Raymond wasn't crying from sadness alone, he was crying from recognition. For the first time in years, he felt like a human being again. Stevie eased back slightly, keeping both hands on Raymond's shoulders as if anchoring him to the present. "Come with me," Stevie said softly. "You're not going back out in that cold." Raymond shook his head instinctively, unused to accepting kindness. No, I can't. I don't belong here." Stevie tilted his chin up gently. "Yes, you do." Raymond's lips parted, stunned. No one had said those words to him in decades. Stevie called over a stagehand. "Get him warm clothes, food, whatever he needs." The crew moved instantly, as if commanded by something greater than a man's voice. Someone brought a thick blanket and draped it around Raymond's shoulders. Another handed him a cup of hot tea, steam curling into the air. Raymond reached out, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. He didn't speak, he couldn't. Tears kept falling, uncontrolled, dripping into the blanket as he tried to swallow the impossible truth. Someone had remembered him, someone had seen him, and not just anyone, Stevie Wonder. But Stevie wasn't finished. He guided Raymond toward a small folding chair near the piano, helping him sit before kneeling beside him. "You still have a gift," Stevie said, his voice steady and full. "And gifts don't disappear. They wait." Raymond's jaw tightened as he tried to form words. "But I got nothing, Stevie. No home, no family, no place to go." Stevie shook his head gently. "You have your voice, and tonight you gave it back to the world." Raymond covered his face again, overwhelmed. Stevie continued, "You might think you're forgotten, but you're wrong. God didn't bring your voice to my door tonight by accident." The room fell still as the weight of those words settled into every corner. Raymond lowered his hands, tears glistening on his cheeks. Stevie squeezed his shoulder one more time. "Brother, you're coming with us. Tonight you're not alone." And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who suddenly felt like family, the blind, homeless man who thought he had nothing left felt something powerful rise in his chest. Hope. Long after the crowd inside the Chicago theater erupted into applause for Stevie's performance, the backstage hallway remained unusually quiet, almost reverent, as if the walls themselves were holding on to the moment that had just unfolded. Crew members moved softly, speaking in hushed voices, still wiping tears from their eyes. The lighting operator leaned against the wall, shaking his head in disbelief. "I never seen anything like that," he whispered to no one in particular. Musicians who had toured the world and witnessed miracles on stage found themselves standing still, humbled by the raw, trembling beauty of a homeless man's voice rising back from the ashes. It wasn't a concert moment, it wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. It was human, painful, holy, and it had reminded everyone in that room why music, real music, matters. Raymond sat in a cushioned chair for the first time in years, a warm blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a plate of food resting on his lap. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite was a privilege he wasn't sure he deserved. A few feet away, Stevie spoke with his manager, his voice low but firm. "I want him taken care of," Stevie said. "Tonight, tomorrow, as long as he needs. He's family." The manager nodded, moved beyond words. When Stevie returned to Raymond's side, he crouched down again, this time with the quiet familiarity of an old friend. "You good?" Stevie asked gently. Raymond nodded, tears pricking his eyes again. I can't believe you remember me." Stevie chuckled softly. "Man, you don't forget a voice like yours. You don't forget a soul like yours." Raymond pressed a shaking hand over his heart, overwhelmed by a kindness he had never expected to feel again. As the night wound down and the final crew members packed up equipment, Stevie placed a warm hand on Raymond's back and guided him toward the exit. Not to the cold alleyway where he'd been found, but to a waiting van with heat blasting and a blanket spread across the seat. "You're coming with us tonight," Stevie said. "We'll figure out the rest." "Tomorrow," Raymond hesitated, tears streaming freely now, his voice barely a whisper. Why are you doing this for me?" Stevie paused, then spoke with the quiet conviction of a man who had lived enough life to understand grace. "Because you gave the world your voice once," he said, "and tonight God made sure I was here to give you something back." Raymond's face crumpled as he climbed into the van, his hands trembling as he clutched the blanket. For the first time in years, he didn't feel forgotten. He didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, remembered, valued. And as the van pulled away from the theater, leaving behind the cold Chicago night, Raymond Holt, once lost, once broken, felt something stir deep inside him. Not fear, not sorrow, but the gentle rising warmth of a man who finally believed his life wasn't over. It was beginning again.